United Nations has released $40 million of emergency funds to civilians caught up in the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia and the rest of the country's conflict hit north. It comes as diplomatic efforts are stepping up to end the fighting. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta held talks with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Addis Ababa. It comes as fighters from the northern Tigray region have been pushing further south this month. Meanwhile, the UN says 10 of its staff are still being detained by Ethiopia's government. More than 70 drivers working for the World Food Programme have also been taken into custody. They're accused of supporting the TPLF. Thousands have been killed and more than 2 million people displaced since the conflict started a year ago. For more on this, let's bring in our correspondent Mohammed Ado. He is live for us in Addis Ababa. Tell us, Mohammed, what more is happening with these diplomatic efforts by Kenya and the US to help resolve this escalating conflict?
Well, yes, that is the intention, to bring this conflict to a quick stop. Olusegun Obasanjo, the AU Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, has expressed some hope that there could be talks between the parties, but he says that is a window that is quickly closing and that any talks will not succeed unless there is a ceasefire. And President Uhuru Kenyatta's visit to Addis Ababa is part of this international effort, which is growing by the day. There is concern among the international community that this conflict could turn into a civil war in a country of 110 million people and in a region which is engulfed in crisis. South Sudan is already facing its own conflict. Sudan has its own problems and instability. Somalia is recovering from conflict. Eritrea, largely a pariah state to the rest of the world, but has its own problems. Now, when Ethiopia, many people think about the possibility of this conflict in Ethiopia turning into a civil war, then the refugee crisis that will result from it will be very difficult for countries that are neighboring Ethiopia to cope with. President Kenyatta is set to meet the U.S. State Secretary Anthony Blinken, who arrives in Kenya sometime today. He will be meeting him on Wednesday to brief him about the discussion he has had with Prime Minister Abiy. There are all other kinds of parallel initiatives to try and bring this war that has caused a massive humanitarian crisis to a stop.
Thank you for that update, Mohammed Ado, live for us in Addis Ababa. For more analysis on this story, there's been ongoing diplomatic efforts in recent weeks over the conflict. The US Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa shuttled between the Ethiopian capital and Nairobi and held a series of meetings last week. The African Union's Special Envoy, who's been leading an international push to stop the fighting, was also in Ethiopia. He's called for an immediate ceasefire. The Ethiopian government wants regional forces to stop attacks and pull out of the Amhara and Afar regions before dialogue can even begin, while the TPLF is demanding an end to the blockade on Tigray. OK. Now it's time to bring in our analysis. Hassan Kananji is the director of the Horn of International Institute for Strategic Studies in Nairobi. He joins us live from Skype. Thanks for joining us, Doctor. What do you make, firstly, of the Kenyan president's visit to Ethiopia in the latest effort to stop this war?
Kenya is an anchor state in the Horn of Africa. I think a visit is to underscore the seriousness with which the region and the world is taking the crisis in Ethiopia, which threatens, of course, a humanitarian crisis that has not been seen in this region in a long time. But critically, I think it's also an attempt to appeal to the parties to cease fire, to be able to allow humanitarian access, because that, I think, has been a sticking point in the conflict, and it's an area that the international community cares about. But perhaps also, finally, it's also an attempt to be able to appeal to the parties, and especially through the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, to consider a possibility of a negotiated settlement in the wake of hardened positions, both by Abiy Ahmed and TPLF.
Diplomatic efforts up until this point haven't stopped rebels advancing towards the capital. What's to say that the Kenyan president and also Blinken's upcoming visit is going to make any difference?
I think these visits can make a difference in a number of ways. Number one, they can communicate potential incentives, but also potential sanctions of continued conflict, especially when it comes to what we call spoils. And if this message is loud enough, and especially in support of the African Union position and efforts towards a resolution, is going to have an impact. Because in the absence of some form of pressure and, of course, incentives, to an agreement, I think it's going to be challenging. So we think both the U.S. visit and American visit, yes, and Kenyan visit, are meant, number one, to communicate a strong message, but also to offer support to a negotiated settlement.
The US has indicated it's looking at sanctioning Addis Ababa. Are sanctions the answer?
Yeah, sanctions are always one aspect of forcing parties to behave responsibly. But it's not enough, it's not sufficient to be able to bring parties to a negotiation. And that is why it's going to be critical that the US also consider certain incentives, especially for the parties who are willing to be able to strike a negotiation or to strike a deal. Number one, to cease fire, so they can allow negotiations to take place, but also to be able to allow a framework in which there's humanitarian access. But on their own in isolation, sanctions are certainly not sufficient.
As you did mention in that answer, is often the case. Civilians are caught up in this political fighting. What has been the impact on Ethiopians over the last 12 months?
Ethiopia was a country was growing at double digits economically, and I think this has made sure that that growth has been reversed, and perhaps for many years to come. Now, the potential implosion of the country, of course, may lead to balkanization, which will not only affect Ethiopia's ability to reclaim itself, but I think it's likely to affect the larger Horn of Africa region in terms of refugees and in terms of just declining security, especially in a region that is also facing problems of terrorism and violent extremism. And so the conflict, I think the biggest danger or it has posed to Ethiopia is the entire project for state formation in a way in which Ethiopia was trying to rebuild itself, of course, after many years of authoritarian rule. And so this is going to take it further back and affect the region even harsher than what was imagined, especially in the wake of COVID-19.
Certainly troubling indeed. Thank you for your insights on this news hour. Dr. Hassan Kananji there, Director of the Horn International Institute of Strategic Studies.